Hello and welcome back to Multimodal. I'm your host, Backseat Future. This is a podcast about GPT-3, multimodal AI models like DALL-E, the company, OpenAI. In this podcast, I may talk about new OpenAI research and products, community initiatives that are going on. I may even talk about my own ideas, my own products, my own research, and definitely in this podcast, I share my thoughts on this space. I try to share current events, and I also try to make sense of what's going on from the perspective of a GPT-3 developer or perhaps a multimodal artist. And I also try to extrapolate, guess, throw out there what all of this could mean for the future. This is not just a podcast about today. This is a podcast about tomorrow. I want to thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Multimodal. We got a lot of ground to cover. I definitely want to talk about the situation with Russia and Ukraine. This is going to be brief. I'm obviously not the geopolitical expert here. This is also not a geopolitical politics podcast. However, this topic is so big and has such big implications for everyone that I simply can't ignore it. We're also definitely going to talk about InstructGPT. This is the InstructGPT podcast. I got so much I want to talk about in this area. I definitely think InstructGPT is game-changing, and I'm hoping to expand on what the implications of InstructGPT, what are they for a GPT-3 developer? What does it mean? Where all of this stuff could be going? And the biggest reason I'm really excited about it is I just feel like not enough people in the community are talking about how great it is. And just like I'm so excited, and I think the fanfare should be a lot greater actually for InstructGPT. So I'm going to be expanding on why I think that is. So with that, let's get started. So definitely the situation with Russia and Ukraine is very grave, very concerning. This is something I've had goosebumps about. This is something I've had a bad feeling about since last year. I put it in writing. We've talked about it in the podcast. I was hoping it wouldn't happen, yet here we are. Unfortunately, this 2022 prediction I had has come to fruition. I really wish it wasn't the case. The main thing that I've personally been dealing with is just if you think about perhaps the range of possible futures here. Obviously, I'm hoping for a very optimistic, very diplomatic solution. However, the range of worst case scenarios in this situation is really bad. And so on a personal note, like I just wanted to share, like I'm not sure what it means for the large language model, multimodal space. What does it mean for our work and our futures? Pretty much everybody's in the same boat. Depending upon how things could pan out in a very bad direction, pretty much the whole tech industry may have to reform and reconsider its role, depending upon what is needed of us. And certainly when people are worried about safety, when they're worried on an existential level, God forbid, the priorities change. There is a hierarchy of needs here. And so, it'll change our relation to our work. It'll change our relation to what we think is important. And the scariest part right now is simply nobody knows. Nobody knows what's going to happen over the next 2 to 3 weeks. But I mean, the only thing that I feel is the next 2 to 3 weeks will be really important. I'm recording this on February 28th, 2022. It'll be really important. It could change everything forever. Depending upon how this stuff pans out, we may have something like 2020, some kind of big event which changes everything for everyone forever. And so anyways, not the best situation. And I want to be clear, my anxieties, my fear, my worries pales in comparison to what's happening, unfortunately, to the Ukrainian community. I want to give a shout out to all the Ukrainians, and, definitely what they're dealing with far exceeds whatever I'm talking about here. But my thoughts are certainly with them. So we're now going to be shifting gears. I want to chat about InstructGPT on that very serious note. We're going to shift gears. So InstructGPT was announced 2 to 3 weeks ago. This is the new engine which OpenAI recommends. Basically, it powers the OpenAI playground and platform. And so what it essentially is, so in clear terms, it's basically the same engines like DaVinci or Ada, except they've been fine-tuned and have also had a rewards-based reinforcement learning on top of it to basically align better with the needs of GPT-3 developers. So what that means is InstructGPT is hopefully, ideally, at least I'm finding, at least it is more cohesive. It's less toxic, right? The research paper announcing it shares the research around it, but from my experience, I found it's less toxic, it's more cohesive, it's easier to use, it's more fun to use, and so it is very beneficial, right, for a GPT-3 developer. And it's so beneficial and it's so easy to use. I've been finding that I've been using the OpenAI playground and platform a whole lot more. I'm starting to use it a couple times a day, simply because it's just so handy. And I think what's changed a lot because of InstructGPT compared to the past, I'm not configuring anything anymore on the side other than maybe response length and temperature. I'm not finding examples. It's just a single shot. And at this point with InstructGPT, I'm not even cherry picking anymore, right? And of course, cherry picking is something the GPT-3 community, large language model community, really doesn't talk about. Like when we share our completions on social media and in our YouTube videos or wherever, how many attempts was it before we finally got that good one, right? What I'm finding with InstructGPT, I've gotten used to single shot, default configurations, no cherry picking at all. Basically the first completion. And this is such a big improvement on top of the existing GPT-3 engines. This has been the dream, basically, not just for a while now in the history of computer science and AI, but just even since 2020. Like I almost wish GPT-3 and OpenAI, the beta launched with not just GPT-3 and the different engines, but also with InstructGPT on top, because it has improved so much the experience of using GPT-3. And in fact, if you've been hesitant to show people, at least I feel, if you've been hesitant to show your friends who don't know anything about GPT-3, if you've been hesitant to show them something like GPT-3, I feel like now is the time. It's a free sign up. It's publicly available. On top of that, InstructGPT is just so straightforward. It makes those first interactions so much easier. You get that magic moment quicker of just interacting meaningfully with a large language model like GPT-3. That I think it will just get more people onboarded faster. I think it will make GPT-3 more viral. And I just feel like if you're also a GPT-3 developer who's been on the fringes, you tried it maybe in 2020 or last year, I encourage you to come back. Come back, give InstructGPT a spin. I think it may impress you in all these different ways. Certainly the biggest implication for InstructGPT is, at least I'm finding I'm not really writing prompts anymore. I wrote a whole article on Substack. I encourage you to check it out on why I think prompt design may be over. Obviously, that's a very clickbaity kind of title, but InstructGPT, it just eliminates a lot of that need to get your examples together, to find really cohesive examples, and you can just jump straight to a zero shot approach, which is what, to be honest, people want. Like I would much rather not write prompts. As much as I appreciate the art form, I would much rather not write prompts, right? And so InstructGPT, I'm just finding I'm writing a lot less prompts, and it's made it so much more. It's made the OpenAI playground so much more handy, so much more convenient, and just I've just been using OpenAI's GPT-3 a lot more. And just to be absolutely clear, nobody else in the large language model market has something even like remotely close to InstructGPT. I spun up Cohere. Essentially, they do not have InstructGPT they do not have an engine like that. And if you compare their largest engine to InstructGPT, it feels like you're using something from the past, like basically from 2020. It's like light years different. It's light years better. Eleuther AI, same thing. The GPT Neo X, GPT J, like they do not have any kind of InstructGPT reinforcement learning with human feedback training, and so they don't even come close, right? So you may end up using prompts for those, but you may not need to for InstructGPT. And I mean, from the research paper, one of the biggest pieces that is just right in the abstract, they found even with a 1.5 billion parameter model, the participants in that research paper, they preferred a 1.5 billion parameter model over GPT-3 DaVinci, 175 billion parameters. And so there's also some implications there. So I've talked about, it could make it more viral. You may find yourself using the OpenAI playground more. You may find yourself writing fewer prompts, right? That's another potential way this could go. I also think just on like the research and, perhaps the industry space and competitive side, the fact that out of a 1.5 billion parameter model, the completions were preferred from that over GPT-3 DaVinci with a 175 billion parameter model. I think the exciting thing about that area is there may be other verticals where other people could perhaps compete with OpenAI. Say you made a 1.5 billion parameter model just for nonfiction writers that has, its own version of InstructGPT where the completions from that far exceed something like definitely GPT-3 DaVinci, and perhaps, because it's so specialized, perhaps even InstructGPT itself. It just opens up new possibilities, I feel, for smaller models. And smaller models, 1.5 billion parameters, you'd spend less in inference costs, right, which is the cost of running the models. And also you could train them and run them perhaps even on a single GPU, I think, maybe 2 GPUs, right? So it's like it could be at that hobbyist level. And so there's some big implications there. Perhaps we may see more verticalized large language model companies that focus perhaps on translation or something of that sort. Now, there are some sort of downsides to InstructGPT, and I hope you've been keeping up. Some downsides are, of course, InstructGPT is only trained in a few categories, right? Like generation, classification, those kinds of things. So I talk about this actually in my Is Prompt Design Over article, but basically, for areas outside of that, if you're finding that InstructGPT is not giving you that great completions or they're not as reliable, you can always just go back to the older engines, like what I call DaVinci Classic. And with DaVinci Classic, you could do some prompt design and maybe get more reliable results. Although in the research paper, OpenAI has said that InstructGPT appears to apply just that general alignment across various areas as well when they had tested it. And so InstructGPT may actually still be beneficial no matter what you're doing. But that part, is still unclear. We still have to figure it out. So anyways, InstructGPT, what does it mean for GPT-3 developers? It means you'll have an easier time developing GPT-3 applications. You'll have less toxic, completions. You'll have more reliable completions. And the biggest thing I'm finding is you may just find yourself using the OpenAI playground far more. Nothing else on the market compares to it. And obviously the big piece is it may actually open new kinds of OpenAI competitors, new kinds of models, maybe stuff that's verticalized. And of course, what happens as a result of InstructGPT, I think, perhaps this is that first little piece. It's a small step, but something much bigger towards the bigger topic of AI alignment and safety. Every day, I feel we are just scratching the surface of what's possible with large language models, our understanding of them. And so it's just really exciting. I cannot recommend enough. Now is the time. Go on the OpenAI website, sign up, create an account, give InstructGPT a spin, ask it questions, right? Ask it to come up with a list of something, right? Ask it to write you a poem. And if you've been on the fringes, InstructGPT is a lot better than the previous Instruct series that you may have tried and thought was kind of meh, to be honest. And so real quick, I just want to talk about an article I put out specifically about one area, which is search. I'm finding I'm using InstructGPT a lot, actually. And then I just want to wrap up and talk about sort of like a last sort of final project I have actually in the InstructGPT space and why I'm excited to work on it. So let's take a look. So one area where I'm finding I'm just using InstructGPT a lot is actually as a Google search alternative, which is crazy to say, right? And so I wrote a whole article. I wrote InstructGPT is greater than Google search. Again, I apologize. This is a very clickbaity article, at least like title wise, right? I talk about, and if you've been listening to the podcast, I've been complaining about Google search for a few weeks now, right? I've been tweeting about it. I talked about it, like I think maybe even 2 episodes ago. So Google search, I feel the quality has declined. And so on one hand, you're seeing Google search has declined quality-wise for all these different reasons. On the other hand, you see something like InstructGPT, and just that delta between what you're looking at and what you know is possible with today's technology is so big that it's almost hard to look at Google. At least I find it's hard to use it knowing there's better alternatives with today's technology. And so I wrote, through, large language models like GPT-3, we've seen great advancements in many of the classic NLP areas like summarization, question and answering, and content generation. And I just find myself using GPT-3, specifically InstructGPT, far more just to answer basic questions instead of something like Google. And in this article, I show side by side different queries that I've entered over the past 2 weeks or so, and show you the difference between Google search results and InstructGPT results, right? So one of the questions I asked is, what are some ways to create sparse neural networks? And so the OpenAI response was, the InstructGPT-3 response was awesome. It gave me 3 points. It answered it in a very cohesive, consistent way. And just the simplicity of the answer was awesome. And I found it beneficial. Meanwhile, the Google results were just, links to articles that, again, obviously maybe have that keyword, right? And so it does not have that Google searches just does not have that aspect of synthesizing information across these articles and simplifying it for me in a way that is digestible. And so I have other examples too of, like for example, so that question of how do you create sparse neural networks, which is a very topical question actually right now in the large language model space. I followed it up with, what are some underexplored ways to create sparse neural networks, right? That's something I followed up with InstructGPT, and it suggested 4 different ways of doing that. Is it 4? Maybe even more. 4 different ways, right? And again, that kind of follow-up is something that I'm not even going to bother doing it on Google search, but it's so valuable. And I almost feel like if Google search could answer questions in these ways, I would do more of those kinds of questions, not just the basic, what are some ways to create sparse neural networks, but the follow-up is, I feel, even more important. What are the underexplored ways, right? And I don't think that's something Google search has the capability to answer at all at this current point in time. Unless somebody writes an article about what are the underexplored ways, Google search will not be able to really answer that question. Then I shared like other examples. So I asked, what makes artists choose some art over others? The GPT-3 InstructGPT, playground, it gave me just a paragraph saying, it's a multitude of factors, but perhaps here's the main ones. Google search, each result is just a time suck of its own. Right? You have to read different people's opinions. You get distracted in all these different ways. Like, you scroll in the article, you see these ads, you're just like, and then obviously the onus of this whole experience of Google search, the onus is on you to read all these different articles and try to piece it together and synthesize it in your head and draw that conclusion. And I mean, maybe there's some positives to that approach, but as a user for a topic like this, I love the simplicity that, the answer is basically summarized in plain text. I don't have to get distracted. It's less mental weight on my head. It's just very convenient. I asked other kinds of questions as well. Why do cats love boxes? Right. And in the article, I try to be fair. Obviously, there's certain queries which I just wouldn't bother putting into InstructGPT, like what's the weather in my area? How to join 2 clips in Adobe Premiere Pro, right? I actually think InstructGPT may be able to answer that question, but I'm a little bit hesitant because, it's a different domain, right, than text. Like you'd have to use Adobe Premiere Pro to really actually explain and give me the best answer for that. I shared reasons why I still use Google search. It's not over for me, right? GPT-3 is far from perfect. It has safety risks. I don't think OpenAI would ever recommend, at least at this point in time, I don't think they'd recommend using InstructGPT as a Google alternative. There's still issues around truthfulness. It may make up information, right? And I understand using Google to verify stuff that InstructGPT says is kind of, it defeats the purpose of using InstructGPT, right? But I'm aware of that, but I think it's still InstructGPT is so compelling, right? And for the most part, this is a very broad generalization. I'm finding it hasn't been making up too much information, although it is much of still a gut thing. I still go with my intuition. Does this seem correct or does this look correct? Is this actually correct? So I still use Google for looking up exact kinds of information, right? This is something that I think, GPT-3 would struggle with. Looking up current information, looking up highly local information. Google search is still super personalized. Like it knows my interests. It knows my location. Google search is still the best as a keyword search engine. Like just this idea that I can type in 2 words and somehow it knows what I mean, right? I think InstructGPT is far from that. Right now, you might enter 2 words and get back a whole poem, right? Then you might hit regenerate again and it would be a list when all you wanted was a crisp paragraph answer. There's certain categories of information like image search, which InstructGPT just can't do. And obviously Google is embedded everywhere. It's on my Android phone, it's in my browser. Sometimes I even use it because I'm too lazy to type a website address into the address bar. InstructGPT is still really promising. It's still really handy. And I genuinely am using it several times a day as a Google search alternative already today. And I mean, I think it's clear. I think this area is a huge area for GPT-3 developers, for machine learning researchers. If this is what's possible almost unintentionally with InstructGPT, what's possible with a very intentional large language model Google search equivalent? Are there verticals of Google search which could, dramatically benefit from improvements in search query alignment and the results users see? I find InstructGPT is very well aligned with the kinds of question I ask it and the answer it gives me. Whereas Google search, the alignment is really limited because they have to find pages on the web that essentially answer that in their own words, right? And so they're limited to what's already out there in a way. Whereas InstructGPT can sort of piece together and synthesize and suggest things, right? And so anyways, huge opportunity for GPT-3 developers. We've talked about it in the past. And of course, towards the end of the article, I talk about OpenAI's been working on something called WebGPT, which not only uses GPT-3 to answer questions, it also can look up stuff on Bing and synthesize the answer with citations, right? And so that research paper is also out too. It could be a huge opportunity if you're a GPT-3 developer, if you're passionate about the search space. I think 2022 is a great time to look in this area. And I guess the last thing I just want to talk about in today's podcast, because there are no InstructGPT alternatives, one of the ideas I've been kicking around is perhaps open sourcing or making some kind of initiative. Like this is a project I'm considering, which could easily, offer some InstructGPT alternative if you're using something like GPT-J or GPT Neo X. This is, kind of out of my wheel well. I mean, there's a lot of machine learning, reinforcement learning that would be required. It may cost a fair amount of money, but I just wanted to put it out there. I'm considering creating something so that all language models could benefit from something like InstructGPT. It would make the large language model space a lot less toxic overall, safer, and obviously whatever I'm a big fan of aligning large language models and this technology with the intentions of the developers, the GPT-3 developers or the large language model developers in particular. Whatever does that, I think, is highly beneficial. As a large language model developer, I just think it's a no-brainer. It would be ideal that the large language model understands my needs and the kinds of completions I want. And so if all the large language model companies and open source projects could have access to something like InstructGPT, which is open source, I think it would be beneficial for the whole community. So this is something I'm kicking around. It's really pretty big, ambitious project. I don't know how much it will cost me, but if you're interested, feel free to hit me up on Twitter at BAKZTFuture. I could use help. I'm looking to learn. I'm looking to get feedback, but it is an area that I'm very, very interested in as a contribution that I could make for the whole community. So with that said, we talked a lot about InstructGPT. I think, search is, a huge one example of how InstructGPT is changing the game. But in general, this thing is awesome. I want to congratulate the team at OpenAI. And I definitely think it is highly, highly beneficial for the GPT-3 developer community. Anyways, that's it for this week's episode. I hope you stay safe. And I just wish everybody in Ukraine and around the world peace, happiness. I hope this stuff. I hope for real positive outcomes here. So, anyways, thank you so much for listening. Multimodal by BackSteveFuture is available everywhere: iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher. You can follow me on YouTube, youtube.com/BAKZTFuture. This podcast, I talked a lot about my Substack newsletter, different articles I've been putting out. I'm going to link them in the show notes as well as the YouTube description below. However, my newsletter is bakztfuture.substack.com. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a great day, night, morning, evening, afternoon, whatever you're up to. I hope it's awesome. Thank you so much for listening. Bye.